Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's archive special. Today, we are going to be taking a look at a special titled Too Much of a Good Thing: The Meteoric Rise and Fall of Slashers. My name's Addison Cove. I'm going to be your presenter today. Just a quick note before we get going. There is a content warning for the presentation itself, as well as the research essay that accompanies it. Between the two of them, they discuss gore, sexual symbology, piercing of flesh, and death. If you have one with any of those, feel free to skip the clips or to reach out for a version of the presentation that does not have those things within them. The films themselves are all available on the BFI archive and accessible predominantly through the archive website, but also in person. Um, the films also have their own content warnings for the feature length productions rather than just the clips that we show today. And so, if you'd like those, that information is also available at the BFI archive. So, without further ado, before we dive into the world of slashers, I think it's really important for us to ground ourselves within what was going on in the horror industry before we reach that point. So, in the 1940s, there's this universal monster madness set of period of time where icons like Dracula, Frankenstein, the Wolfman, Mummy, basically any costume that you can imagine buying your kid nowadays for Halloween became really large deals because Universal Studios developed a kind of philosophy when it came to filmmaking of putting the villain at the center of the horror film, and the protagonist and the overarching story was really minimalized, and these icons, sort of larger than life characters, were emphasized because they represented a big money making scheme. And just like most money making franchises and opportunities, oversaturation flooded the market by the end of the 40s, and the genre descended into parody as effects couldn't keep up with the visions for these large scale monsters. As horror declined, we know, if you're familiar with the time period, it was replaced by sci-fi and noir. That's just a brief kind of flashback to the 1940s. And just for the ease of your access, I'm going to plot that on this chart here. Obviously, as we go through, that will fill up nicely. But moving swiftly on, uh, in the 70s, after some stagnation in the horror genre, we reach what I would describe as a renaissance for the horror genre. So, in this kind of period of time, the 70s and the 60s, the late 60s beforehand, you've got a lot of people playing around with a lot of new ideas and experimenting, inventing subgenres. So Cronenberg, obviously, at the forefront of developing body horror, that kind of represents this internal struggle against yourself and that manifesting in an outward way. Occult horror, so that's kind of your ideals being attacked and people's foundational beliefs like religion. Obviously, films like The Exorcist are really influential here, one of the best selling horror films of all time, if you adjust for inflation. And proto slashers sort of start to emerge here. Now, that's an interesting phrase that we're going to break apart anyway, but just talking about those other two, if body horror is this internal struggle against yourself manifesting, and occult is the attack on ideals from kind of a spiritual plane, then proto slashers really represented that external threat coming for you. So it was almost the reverse of body horror in a way. It's that sort of, rather than an internal source being attacked from something inside your body, it was an internal guilt being attacked by the outside world in a manifestation. So I've plotted the 1970s on our graph here. Now, I will point out at this point, the graph is obviously not made to scale. The 1940s and 1970s, if they were that close together, then we're going to reach a whole new pinnacle of ages before we get to the end of the graph. But do not worry, it's just so it remained on a side of the screen that I found visually appeasing. So, what actually is a slasher then? I've spoken about proto slasher, but before we can start really getting into the origins of a slasher, we kind of need to know what the telltale signs we're looking out for are, so we can spot when this kind of slasher genre fully emerges from its cocoon. And so I've tried to break it down into some really key codes and conventions that kind of stick around this genre. So You have this masked, faceless killer. That's a really core recurring theme. Isolated setting, group of victims plus a final girl. Very quickly, if you're not familiar with the final girl archetype, that is the idea of this final character that stands against the monster in the end of the film. It's normally based on some sort of virtuosity that that character possesses that the others don't. Very typically in horror, it's to do with virginity or perceived purity. And obviously, you can't talk about slashers without including kill counts, very high kill counts, much higher than a lot of the other horror genres, and creative deaths. Very visual, very on screen, and very in your face use of production techniques in order to create close, high octane kills. So now we know what a slasher contains, we have to have a look at where they actually come into being. I spoke about this 1970s period being a great renaissance in horror, but I want to fully put my hands in the air. And this is explored a little bit further in the research essay that accompanies this. But there is an Italian movement that, you know, if it walks like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, it probably is a duck. Italian giallo is all but a slasher. It is, in essence, a lot of the same ideas. The main difference is the focus on kind of artistic experimentation. And as that slowly gets refined and brought over to American studios that like to produce more reliable results, we find that that kind of slowly morphs into the slasher genre. So Giallo is defined by its stylish killers. They're not as hidden in the shadows as they potentially are on the slasher genre itself. It is the place where these POV shots get introduced, and we're going to explore that a little bit later on. Slowly, as I say, this transformation happens. Giallo placed a much more heavy emphasis on having a mystery involved, so it's almost got an element of noir to it. And that starts to slowly strip back as action is kind of put in place of that mystery, and slasher kind of takes form. Early films start incorporating this. Psycho and Texas Chainsaw have some of the previous elements I've talked about, but obviously are lacking others. So Psycho doesn't have that high kill count. Texas Chainsaw really lacks that. Well, I would say it lacks that isolated setting in the same way that others do, and also lacks the morality play aspect that slashers become known for. But here's a Psycho picture, not to jump scare you, but there it is. This iconic imagery I've picked here to show that Psycho fitted a lot of the aspects of slasher in terms of its villain, its faceless killer appearing. Obviously, the knife is really important here as well because that later comes into play when we talk about Halloween. But the main element that was missing is obviously the killing spree, the multiple murders that on screen take place with a visual, gory aspect. I've plotted Black Christmas here, and we're going to explore that a little bit further. But Black Christmas is what I believe to potentially be the pinpoint where you can start saying, okay, this is sort of where the ideas that were floating around in lots of different films like Texas Chainsaw, Giallo Cinema, also in Psycho, they all sort of get mushed together in this relatively unknown cult classic horror film, which feels decades ahead of its time. I would thoroughly recommend you have a watch. If you haven't seen the film all the way through, it holds up remarkably well today. I'm going to play a short clip for us. This is the first of 4 clips. This is Black Christmas, and this is the scene where we finally see our final girl confront the killer after a whole movie of being stalked. So please enjoy, and we'll talk about it afterwards. Okay, so just to pick apart what we've watched really quickly before moving on, what does that film possess that, or what does that clip show us that I've seen that I wanted to expand on? There is that kind of element of an isolated location. I think you can tell that just from the shots around the house. Throughout the film, we have a really good understanding of the geology of the scene, and that helps us geography, sorry, of the scene, and that helps us know where we're located and feel connected to the character. It's a film based on hiding spots and us potentially being in the know uh, when the main characters don't. Um, what's lacking here in terms of what evolves later on is this kind of supernatural element that seems to build into the slasher genre, and as we move on, as Black Christmas there. Move on a little bit later, just 4 years later, we kind of encounter the first major film in the slasher subgenre. So, whilst there's others that come before that make small disruptions within the industry, as we're going to talk about later, slasher genre really rose to prominence so quickly because it managed to capitalize on mascot kind of mentality and this idea of managing to build in a large amount of iconic villains into the genre. So Halloween's really the birthplace of that. If there's a trilogy of slashers with Halloween, Nightmare on Elm Street, and Friday the 13th, then Halloween is the earliest adopter to get here. John Carpenter really cements the genre. It says redefines. Since making this, I don't know if redefined is the right word. It's close. He does introduce new things, and that supernatural element is one of them. But what he really does is cements the genre in the public mind and builds it into a popular genre. So uh, I have a clip from Halloween that I want to show. And here we go. Starting from here. Okay, so what am I hoping for you to get out of that clip? Well, I can hear you on the edge of your seat waiting to find out, and I won't keep you in suspense. Um, what I'm really aiming for you to see is how similar Black Christmas and Halloween are here. Those scenes that we shot side by side, they're both in this sort of large house environment. A lot of the scenery is the same. We've got a reveal of past killings before the final confrontation. So all of this is lining up. One thing I will draw your attention to is this increasing of body count that's happening here. So as we go through a little bit further, you're going to see this rising of body counts throughout the genre. And that's kind of the spiral that leads to its demise in the end. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The killing increases here. We're seeing 4 dead bodies rather than 2. So we've already doubled. More is more was the slasher philosophy. And you can see that being applied here. But Michael Myers is still very simplistic in his design. I mean, it's a pair of work overalls and just a simple mask. So that made it really easy for that costume to kind of be replicated and symbolized if you want your kid to go dressed out as a killer for Halloween, but also uh, made him iconic in the way that he could be replicated. So, what worked for studios? Why did studios see Halloween and go, that's it, we're hitting the big time here, time to make some slashers? Well, it's quite simple, really. If you've worked in the production industry, then you'll understand the economics of it. They're very cheap to make. Um, really, it's accomplished with some very small crews. The good news is you can use very unknown actors. We see an early Jamie Lee Curtis there, but obviously unknown actors with cheap production costs. Normally one camera. It means that you can produce these films for a very low budget and get huge returns off of the merchandising, especially. Um, when we later explore films like Friday the 13th, Part 5, which is later on in the presentation, but all the way up to that, we start to see studios actually weighing up the cost of the film with the merchandising. So they're considering not just the profits from the actual films themselves, but the profits that they can make from the kind of franchise of these villains. And it's really weird because a lot of the money is coming from action figures and costumes, things that are really actually aimed at children, despite these films being some of the most gory stuff that was commercially on offer at the time. But Hollywood saw that audiences were biting into this slasher genre. They wanted the kind of adrenaline, they wanted the thrill, and they wanted the kills that kept the pace a lot higher than was happening in other horror genres at the time. I mean, body horror potentially have one or two victims per film on average. Normally, it's more about internalized than killing others. Maybe The Brood is an exception by Cronenberg, but in general, a lower kill count. And the same really with demonic possession film. This is all about a small unit, maybe a family, being haunted by this ghost. Then we get the rise of this big three, and I spoke about this earlier, but these are the main villains that kind of rise from the ashes of the slasher genre in terms of lots of films try at this time to kind of capture the audience's brands and become franchises, but the three that really stick out are Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees, and Freddy Krueger, the three iconic villains. Now you can see actually a lot of similarities in the designs being easy to replicate, apart from Freddy Krueger's face, which is obviously very intricate. But for the most part, they wear some sort of overalls or some sort of workman's clothes that you might have lying around. And then they have a mask or something that would be fairly easy to replicate. Um, these villains were kind of the brands of the films. And once again, going back to that 40s horror, which is why I introduced it in the beginning, mascots once again became the kind of key focus. The horror genre had fallen back into the same hole it had been in before of the films were secondary to generating mascots or generating icons that culturally were very significant. Uh, what did that do to the quality of the film, though? That's the real question. And luckily for you, it's a question that I've got the answer to, hopefully. So sequels just endlessly escalated, just like we saw in that beginning pattern, Black Christmas to Halloween. That only spiraled further and further as kill counts skyrocketed. Films, horror merged with action more heavily. Action was more palatable to audiences than horror. So the foundation of slasher started to become more in action and less in horror, which was obviously surprising for a horror subgenre. But it was something that started to happen because people didn't necessarily want to take their kid to see a horror movie, but they might take their kid to see an action movie, or at least they might show their teenager it. Um, the villains also appeared on screen for a lot longer. their screen time goes up exponentially through the franchises. Spectacle is emphasized over suspense. It's more about callbacks and what's the next big cinematic moment we're going to have. And anti-hero villains emerge. So we had some movies that tried to capitalize on potentially the villains being the heroes. We're going to look at Friday the 13th, Part 5. You can see horror versus action in play here. You can see the lack of suspense. You can see the villain focus, and you can see how comedy was starting to seep into the franchise with the ridiculousness of the situation. So sit tight, grab onto your seat. Here is the iconic Friday the 13th, Part 5 chainsaw fight.
Jason?
Listen to me! Run! No! Tommy, get up! Get
Jason?
up! Listen! Oh, Tommy, no!
Don't.
I'm here, Tommy! Come on! I'm here! Come on! Come on!
Yeah, so to really boil that down there, what we've watched is Jason have a chainsaw fight with one of our victims, and then he lets her escape, at which point Tommy turns up. Tommy stands there and lets Jason slash him in the chest, and then Jason waits patiently for Tommy to unfold his little knife and stab him in the leg. I mean, we're really witnessing kind of what you would call the scariness factor of the villains diminish quite heavily during this time period. And that can be seen with the sales of the films. The oversaturation, which is a very familiar story from the 1940s, mixed with this kind of escalating kill count and focus on action with diminishing horror returns, means that box offices drop very sharply. And just like they did in the 40s here, it's not a slow decline. Kind of slashers were popular until they weren't. And then in the 1990s, just almost like a cliff, the slashers just drop off. The sales are nowhere near as high. People start to ridicule these films and see these characters as jokes or caricatures rather than serious horror villains. And that really takes a dent on the core horror audience that was holding up a lot of these franchises. Um, and that could be the end of our story. That could be where we say, mourning to the death of horror movies, not horror movies, slasher movies. That's the death of them. Goodbye. But in 1996, Wes Craven comes along, and ironically, for being one of the people that was probably most brutalized by the slasher industry, pushed out of his own film after establishing one of the core three franchises, Wes Craven comes along and revitalizes this slasher genre in a new form. Scream presented a self-aware meta commentary on the slasher genre that managed to bring audiences back that had been laughing at the genre by joining in on the joke and creating films that were scary again, but laughed at the kind of ridiculousness of some of these past horror mistakes. So, my final clip is a very short clip from Scream, and it's iconic, so you've probably seen it before. But here we go.
What's that noise?
Popcorn.
You making popcorn?
Uh-huh.
I only eat popcorn at the movies.
Well, I'm getting ready to watch a video.
Really? What?
Oh, just some scary movie.
You like scary movies?
Uh-huh.
What's your favorite scary movie?
I don't know.
You have to have a favorite. What comes to mind?
Halloween. You know, the one with the guy in the white mask who walks around and stalks babysitters?
Yeah.
What's yours?
That's it. That's what I wanted to show you, that self-referential moment. I mean, the movie is filled with them, but that was the first moment that really sprung to mind when I was thinking of a self-referential moment in Scream. The iconic knife with the Halloween reference kind of shows that mocking of the horror genre, that the main characters aren't scared of the horror genre either in the films, which is what makes them vulnerable again. And slashers live on today, as we know. As we live in this world, we know that slashers haven't gone extinct. In fact, they're more popular than ever, and they have an influence on most horror genres now. Incorporate higher kill counts than they would have done if slashers hadn't gained that huge popularity. So they did change the industry for the better. That is the presentation. That is the archive special. I hope you've enjoyed your time with us today. I'm sorry that 30 minutes is so short. But if you want any more information, please read the supporting research essay. And if you would like to access these films, which I would strongly advise you to, please use the BFI archive and go and view some of these awesome pieces of slasher history. Thank you very much for watching. Bye for now.